I want you to just try to picture something in your mind right now. Like, literally close your eyes if you have to, and picture this classic historical company town.
Right, the kind of place we've touched on a few times in the series.
Exactly. We've talked about these sprawling, totally foreign-owned enclaves before. So try to visualize this massive banana plantation, completely carved out of the tropical jungle back in the early 1900s. Or maybe like a deep copper mine terraced into this super remote mountainside.
Yeah, very visually striking.
It is. And guarding that operation, like literally walking the perimeter wire, you have a private army, you have actual men carrying Winchester rifles, standing right at the iron gates, and they're making absolutely sure that the workers stay in line, the strikes are broken, and, all the profits flow straight out to some foreign capital.
Because that historical model of resource extraction, it was just fundamentally about physical territory and physical force.
It really was.
I mean, if we look back at the early 20th century, at a company like Forestal, this was this massive foreign-owned timber monopoly, right? They operated in the remote Quebracho forests of Argentina.
Huh.
And they didn't just own the trees.
No, they owned literally everything.
Exactly. They owned the towns, the stores, they even printed their own local currency. And they essentially operated their own private, militarized police force.
Which is just wild to think about.
It's staggering. They were called the Gendarmeria Volante. And they were a mounted cavalry, and their literal job was to physically crush labor strikes. They would hunt down workers who tried to escape the debt peonage system.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, you really need to understand that historically, corporate power and global trade, it relied on actual physical bullets.
Yeah.
You could see the borders of the empire, and you could look right at the enforcers holding the guns.
Right. It's visceral. It's completely brutal. I mean, you don't have to guess who is in charge when the boss literally has a private cavalry.
Absolutely not.
But so here is the central question for our deep dive into the dossier today.
Yeah.
This is the puzzle we are going to spend the next hour really taking apart. What happens if you strip away the bananas?
Right.
Like, what happens if you take away the timber and the copper? But, crucially, you keep the entire power structure perfectly intact.
The exact same dynamics.
Exactly. You keep the boundary line, you keep the foreign ownership, you keep that massive extraction of wealth from the global south to the global north. But the enforcer is no longer a private militia standing there with rifles.
The enforcer changes completely.
It does. It becomes this much more elegant and, frankly, completely invisible weapon.
And that transformation, that pivot, is exactly what our research dossier for today explores. We are looking at the modern maquiladora and the free trade zone.
Yes, a modern enclave.
Because if you want to understand the global economy today, you really have to realize that this factory system is essentially the contemporary capstone of that old, brutal enclave economy we just talked about.
Only today it's not bananas.
Right. Today, the engine isn't driven by fruit monopolies or, mining conglomerates. It is driven by United States and European fast fashion brands, consumer electronics companies, auto parts manufacturers.
All the stuff we buy every day.
Exactly. And they operate through this vast, intentionally complex network of local subcontractors, primarily concentrated in Mexico and Central America.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because this deep dive is going to fundamentally challenge how you look at the actual physical clothes hanging in your closet right now.
It really reframes everything.
It totally does. We aren't just going to, read down a boring list of abstract trade policies or tariff codes. We are going to explore how a factory's freedom to simply move, its legal and logistical ability to pack up its machines and abandon a country overnight, how that became the ultimate disciplinary tool.
The threat of exit.
Right. And what's truly wild to wrap your head around is that the consumer market, the one that you and I participate in every single day when we click add to cart on a cheap t-shirt or a new smartphone, is the primary fuel pumping through this entire engine.
Yeah, we are all part of it. And to grasp how this new invisible weapon of mobility actually functions on the ground, we first need to look at the physical architecture of global trade.
How it was actually built.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We have to trace how the physical footprint of the old historic enclave, that fenced-off company town guarded by the Gendarmeria Volante, how that was repurposed. Because it didn't just vanish.
It evolved.
Right. It was modernized and legally reconstructed into the tax-free export zones of the late 20th century.
Right, because governments and corporations didn't just invent the modern sweatshop out of thin air. They built it directly on top of the old colonial foundation.
Brick by brick, essentially.
So, How do we get from a timber monopoly with a private cavalry to an industrial park in Mexico making blue jeans for the American mall? What's the timeline there?
Well, the transition really hinges on a very specific pivot in economic policy.
Uh-huh.
If we trace the history of this modern system, the real birth of the maquiladora as we know it starts in the mid-1960s, specifically 1965.
1965. Okay.
Yeah. This is when the Mexican government launched what was called the Border Industrialization Program, or the BIP. And to understand why Mexico did this, you really have to look at what was happening demographically at that exact moment.
What was going on?
In 1964, the United States abruptly ended the Barrero program.
Oh, wow. Okay, for those who might not be familiar with the Bracero program, what was the immediate fallout of that ending? Like, what did that actually look like on the ground?
Well, so the Bracero program was this massive guest worker agreement that allowed millions of Mexican men to work legally in U.S. agriculture.
Right, mostly farms in the Southwest, right.
Exactly. So when the U.S. suddenly canceled it in '64, hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers were immediately sent back across the border. They ended up completely stranded in these northern Mexican border cities.
Places like Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez.
Mexicali, Tijuana, Juarez. And the Mexican government was utterly terrified of mass unemployment and social unrest along the border. They desperately needed a way to generate jobs, and they needed it fast.
Because you suddenly have this massive population just sitting there with no income.
Exactly. And at the exact same time, U.S. manufacturers were actively looking for ways to lower their labor costs to compete with rising industrial powers in Asia, like Japan.
So you basically have a massive pool of desperate, unemployed labor on one side of a line in the sand, and a massive pool of corporate capital looking to save a buck on the other side. It's like a perfect storm.
It was precisely the catalyst. So Mexico looks at export processing zones that were just starting to pop up in places like Taiwan and Ireland, and they create the BIP.
The Border Industrialization Program.
Yes. And the mechanics of this policy are literally the DNA of the modern global supply chain. The BIP allowed foreign corporations, which were almost exclusively American at this point, to import machinery, raw materials, and components into Mexico completely duty-free.
Wait, completely tax-free, no import taxes at all?
None at all. But there was a strict legal catch. These materials were allowed into the country strictly to be assembled, and the finished goods had to be immediately re-exported back out of Mexico.
Okay, I'm trying to visualize the actual logistics of this. Let's say I am a major American clothing brand in 1966.
Okay.
Under this new program, I can put a bunch of sewing machines on a train in Ohio, buy raw denim from Texas, buy thread and zippers, and ship all of it across the border into Ciudad Juarez.
Yeah.
And the Mexican government doesn't charge me a single dime in customs duties for bringing that stuff in.
Not a dime.
My newly hired workers in Juarez sit at those machines, they sew the denim into jeans, and then I put those finished jeans right back on a truck, send them back into Texas, and sell them in Chicago.
That is exactly how it worked.
Yeah.
And the U.S. government actually facilitated this on their end, too.
Really? How so?
Under specific U.S. tariff codes at the time, when you brought those finished jeans back into the United States, you didn't pay taxes on the total value of the jeans. You only paid a tax on the value added by the Mexican labor.
Oh my God.
Right. And since the Mexican labor was paid literal pennies on the dollar compared to an American garment worker, the tax you paid was microscopic.
That is such a rigged system.
It really was. The host country, Mexico, provides the physical land, the factory building, the water, the electricity, and crucially, the cheap human labor. The foreign company provides the capital, the raw materials, and takes 100% of the finished product and the profit.
Meaning the profits never actually touch the Mexican economy.
Exactly.
The factory is physically sitting in Mexico, utilizing Mexican roads, Mexican water, and Mexican citizens, but economically it might as well be floating in outer space.
That legal isolation is the absolute defining characteristic of the free trade zone. That was the seed that got planted in '65.
Wow.
And if you fast forward through the 70s and 80s, you see this maquiladora sector growing steadily. It expands from textiles into auto parts and consumer electronics.
So like more complicated stuff.
Yeah, televisions, radios, car wire harnesses.
Yeah.
You also start seeing Central American and Caribbean countries trying to copy this model, setting up their own free trade zones under various U.S. trade initiatives.
Right, everyone wants a piece of the action.
But the real turning point, the massive historical accelerator that essentially poured gasoline on this entire system, happened on January 1st, 1994.
NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Yes.
This is the moment the whole game changes, doesn't it?
NAFTA fundamentally rewired the North American continent. When it took effect, it removed almost all remaining tariffs and trade barriers between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
It just erased the economic borders.
Completely. And it supercharged the Mexican maquiladora sector. Foreign investment just flooded into the border zones at a scale that is, honestly, almost difficult to comprehend today.
Give us an idea of the scale.
To give you a sense of the sheer volume, by the year 2000, so just 6 years after NAFTA, these border factories, these maquiladoras, were generating roughly 48% of Mexico's total exports.
Wait, I have to stop and highlight that number. 48%.
Almost half.
Almost half of an entire sovereign nation's export economy was coming out of these specific, walled-off, foreign-owned industrial parks?
Yes. We are talking millions of workers, thousands of massive factories stretching across the desert. Entire cities just exploded in population.
Unbelievable.
Ciudad Juarez went from a mid-sized border town to a sprawling industrial metropolis in a matter of a decade, driven almost entirely by the insatiable demand of the maquiladora industry.
When you look at that staggering scale, you really realize that the old tax exemptions, like the ones that used to be granted as land and railroad concessions to giant fruit companies in Central America in the early 1900s, they haven't disappeared at all.
No, they've just evolved.
They've just been rebranded as free trade zones. It's basically like downloading a software update for a 19th century colonial empire.
That's a great way to put it.
The company town survives, but now it's a walled industrial park with a badge swipe at the front gate. And the host country still absorbs all the physical footprint, the massive migration of workers, the huge strain on local housing, the environmental pollution of the rivers, the heavy truck traffic, but the corporate profits, those are walled off behind an invisible legal force field.
And what's really fascinating here is the precision of the United States' role in this modern architecture. It is distinct from older empires.
How do you mean?
Well, unlike the historical examples of, say, British or Spanish colonialism, or even early American interventions in Latin America, the U.S. isn't acting as a military occupier here. There's no territorial conquest.
No Marines landing on the beach.
Exactly. No flags planted in the ground. Instead, the U.S. functions as the primary consumer market, the corporate home base for the brands, and the chief architect of the geopolitical trade policies like the BIP and NAFTA that make the system legal and highly profitable.
So the system thrives entirely on this legal and geographic distance.
Completely. The distance is the point.
It's brilliant in a very dark, incredibly structural way, which naturally forces us to ask the next logical question, right?
Thank God.
If you have these massive walled industrial parks, and they are responsible for half of a country's exports, and they are so vital to the global supply chain that brands literally rely on them for their quarterly profits, you have to maintain order.
You absolutely do.
The people working inside those walls have to keep working fast and cheap. But as we established at the start of this deep dive, you don't have the U.S. Marines anymore. You don't have the Gendarmeria Volante riding horses with rifles.
Right. The armed guards are gone.
So if a worker on the assembly line stands up and says, "I'm exhausted, I want a raise," how do you keep them in line?
Well, you need a new mechanism of discipline.
Yeah.
One that doesn't rely on the optics of violence, because frankly, violence is really bad PR for modern consumer brands.
Nobody wants to buy a T-shirt stained with literal blood.
Exactly. And this brings us to arguably the most crucial concept in the entire research dossier: mobility as discipline.
Mobility?
Yes. The new private army isn't an army of men at all. It is the existential threat of capital flight. The unspoken and honestly often very explicitly spoken threat by management is that if workers in one of these maquiladoras demand higher pay or safer working conditions, or if they dare to try and form an independent labor union, the brand will simply pull its orders.
Just like that.
Just like that. And because the entire factory relies on the contracts from those foreign brands, if the brand pulls the orders, the factory has no reason to exist.
The factory dies.
It dies overnight. Management will just shutter the doors, lay off 3,000 people with zero severance, pack the sewing machines or the soldering irons into shipping containers, and the brand will just shift its production to a subcontractor in a cheaper, more compliant country.
That is brutal.
It is. This mechanism, the hypermobility of capital, creates this massive, brutal, global race to the bottom.
Let's really break down that race to the bottom concept, because it gets thrown around a lot in economics, but the reality on the ground is staggering. We are talking about entire sovereign nations actively competing against one another, right? Like,
Yes.
they're competing to offer foreign brands the worst possible conditions for their own citizens.
That's exactly what happens. You have the trade minister of Honduras looking at the trade minister of El Salvador, and they are actively undercutting each other.
Trying to win the bid.
Right. One says, hey, we will offer a 10-year tax holiday and a minimum wage of $1 an hour. And the other counters, well, we will offer a 15-year tax holiday, a minimum wage of 90 cents an hour, and we promise our environmental and labor regulators will literally never set foot in the free trade zone.
And they do this simply out of desperation.
Completely. Just to keep the factories from leaving because they so desperately need the foreign currency.
You know, here's where this gets deeply fascinating to me because it fundamentally changes how we traditionally think about power.
How so?
Well, human history basically teaches us that power is inherently tied to land. Kings, empires, corporations, they conquered territory. They held it, they defended it with big walls and massive armies. To lose territory was to lose power.
Right, territorial sovereignty.
But this system flips that entirely upside down. It's
Wow.
almost like it's like having a landlord who, the second you complain about a broken heater in the middle of winter, doesn't send guys with baseball bats to intimidate you into paying rent.
No, they don't need to.
Instead, the landlord just threatens to make the entire apartment building vanish into thin air. Like, you wake up, the building is just gone, you are standing freezing on an empty concrete lot, and the building has magically reappeared in a totally different country where the tenants are too terrified to ever ask for heat.
That analogy actually captures the legal and economic reality perfectly. The modern enclave economy no longer needs to conquer ground to exert dominance.
It just threatens to leave.
It only needs to threaten to abandon it.
Yeah.
The power comes directly from the ability to leave. And when the penalty for speaking up about a broken ventilation system or an unpaid overtime shift is the total economic devastation of your entire town,
People stay quiet.
the compliance you get from the workforce is almost absolute. The coercion is entirely structural. It is bloodless, there are absolutely no guns, but it is flawlessly effective.
And that structural bloodless thread of exit hanging over the factory roof, it creates a hyper-pressurized environment inside those walls.
Intensely pressurized.
The pressure from the brand to produce faster, cheaper, and without a single delay gets passed directly from the buyer in New York to the subcontractor management in Mexico, straight down to the factory floor.
Straight to the workers.
Which brings us to the actual human beings trapped inside the system. Because it's one thing to talk about capital flight and macroeconomic trade agreements, but we have to look at how this hyper-pressurized system views the physical bodies of the workers keeping it alive.
Absolutely. And the demographics of the workforce are not an accident at all. They are a highly calculated feature of the system's overall design.
Who are they hiring?
If we look at the historical data, particularly in the garment and light assembly sectors of the maquiladoras and free trade zones, the workforce is predominantly made up of young women,
Young women.
usually in their late teens and early 20s. And many of them are internal migrants, moving from deeply impoverished rural areas in southern Mexico or Central America, heading up to the northern border cities seeking work.
So they are already displaced, already vulnerable.
Very vulnerable. And management explicitly seeks them out based on these deeply ingrained patriarchal assumptions.
I'm assuming this ties into the infamous nimble fingers justification.
Yes, exactly. The nimble fingers doctrine. Factory managers and recruiters frequently cite this idea that young women are biologically, naturally better suited for the tedious, microscopic, highly repetitive work of sewing garments or soldering tiny components onto motherboards.
Which is, frankly, just a convenient biological myth used to justify putting a specific demographic on an assembly line for literal pennies.
It is a profound rationalization. But combined with the nimble fingers myth is an even darker calculation, and this one is regarding presumed docility.
Docility, like they won't fight back.
Precisely. The prevailing assumption by factory management, which is documented extensively in the labor scholarship we reviewed, is that young, often rural, often unmarried women are less likely to organize into unions.
Right.
They assume they are less likely to strike and far more likely to accept harsh authoritarian discipline from a male boss than older men would be.
So the system specifically targets a population it perceives as inherently vulnerable and easily intimidated.
It's a calculated filter.
So you actively filter your hiring process to assemble the most vulnerable population possible, and then you subject them to staggering operational demands. The dossier notes the hours these women are forced to work, and we aren't talking about a standard 9 to 5.
Not at all. 12-hour shifts are standard practice in many of these zones.
12 hours.
And during peak production time, say, when a U.S. brand needs a massive order of winter coats rushed out for the holiday season, mandatory overtime is strictly enforced. The research details periods where work weeks stretch up to 70 or even 75 hours a week.
Try to actually internalize that. 75 hours a week,
Right.
just sitting on a stool, leaning over a sewing machine under buzzing fluorescent lights, doing the exact same physical motion thousands upon thousands of times a day.
The repetitive stress is enormous.
That is just endless grinding, physical depletion, and all of this labor, this destruction of the body's joints and eyesight is for poverty wages.
The economic data consistently shows that the wages paid in these export zones fall well below any internationally recognized living wage standard.
They can't even survive on it.
They barely cover the cost of basic food and a bed in a crowded shanty town on the outskirts of the industrial park.
But as dark as the hours and the wages are, there is a specific, deeply invasive practice detailed in our sources that I think strips away any illusion about how this system views human beings.
Yes. The dossier heavily highlights the findings of two major human rights investigations from the late 1990s. And this concerns the pregnancy testing regime.
You know, when I read this section of the notes, I actually had to stop and reread it because I genuinely couldn't believe it wasn't just an anecdotal rumor.
It was very real.
You're telling me this was a documented, systemic corporate policy across multiple factories?
It was widespread and deeply institutionalized. Human rights investigators published a watershed report in '96 called No Guarantees, and they followed it up with another exhaustive report in '98 called A Job or Your Rights.
And what did they find?
These investigations documented exactly how the maquiladora sector handled the biological reality of its overwhelmingly female workforce.
Walk us through the exact mechanics of this. How on earth did a factory justify this, and how do they actually enforce it?
Well, the root of the issue lies in a clash between Mexican domestic law and corporate profit margins.
Okay.
Under the Mexican Federal Labor Code, pregnant workers are legally entitled to maternity leave, job protection, and certain state-mandated healthcare benefits.
Which is pretty standard in most of the world.
Right. But to a factory manager operating on the razor-thin margins dictated by a foreign brand, a pregnant worker is suddenly viewed as a costly liability.
A threat to the bottom line.
Exactly. So to avoid paying those legally required maternity costs, many maquiladoras instituted mandatory pregnancy testing as a strict condition of employment.
So a young woman walks into the factory clinic applying for a job, and before they even ask about her skills or her experience, they demand a urine sample.
Exactly. They would require urine tests or, in some extreme cases, invasive physical examinations by company doctors. And if the test came back positive, she was denied the job. Full stop.
That is infuriating.
But the policy didn't end at the hiring phase. That's what makes it so systemic. If a woman who was already employed on the assembly line became pregnant, the factories utilized severe harassment.
Very clear on her own.
Right. Or they would outright fire her on totally fabricated grounds just to avoid paying the maternity leave.
Which is a blatant, undeniable violation of both Mexican domestic law and international human rights treaties.
Oh, absolutely.
But the specific detail from those reports that really stopped me cold. I mean, the most visceral, disturbing part of the documentation was the method of enforcement used for women already working on the line. Because obviously the factory doctors couldn't constantly test thousands of women every single week, right?
No, they didn't have the resources for that. So the line supervisors took matters into their own hands. The reports detail how, in certain plants, male supervisors would pull women off the line and demand to know when their last menstrual cycle was.
Oh my God.
And in the most extreme, humiliating cases documented, women were actually required to show used sanitary napkins to their managers as physical proof that they were menstruating and therefore not pregnant.
I want you to really sit with that image for a second. The complete annihilation of privacy, the sheer degradation of standing in a factory bathroom, proving to a floor manager that your body is not carrying a child just so you can keep your minimum wage job sewing t-shirts.
It is horrific.
So what does this all mean? When you look at a practice like that, you realize that in the modern enclave, the worker's body itself has been reduced to a site of inspection.
Literally.
It is absolutely no different than a mechanic checking the oil levels in a forklift or reading the pressure gauge on a boiler. It's a literal meter read-in of a human machine to ensure it is operating at maximum cost efficiency. If the human machine is pregnant, it threatens the profit margin, it becomes a defective unit, and it is discarded.
It is the ultimate literal commodification of the female body.
Yeah.
The worker is entirely reduced to her capacity to produce for the brand.
Yeah.
Now, as an analyst, it is important for me to provide the context of the current reality regarding these practices today.
Right. This was the late 90s.
Exactly. Following the massive international outcry generated by those reports, the practice of overt, mandatory pregnancy testing at the factory gates was widely condemned. It remains strictly illegal under Mexican law.
But, I mean, just because it's illegal doesn't mean the economic incentive to avoid pregnant workers disappeared, right?
No.
The brand is still squeezing the subcontractor on price.
Precisely. The eradication of this practice is highly uneven. It is heavily disputed, depending on which specific region, which tier of subcontractor, and which industry you're actually looking at.
It goes underground.
Labor advocates argue forcefully that while you might not see the overt urine tests at the front gate of a major Tier 1 supplier today, the pressure, the discrimination, and the covert pushing out of pregnant workers absolutely persist in the shadows of the supply chain.
Because the underlying economic calculus hasn't changed one bit.
It hasn't.
And when we discuss the intense vulnerabilities of this specific demographic, we are talking hundreds of thousands of young, often transient, rural women relocated to unfamiliar border cities, working exhausting shifts for poverty wages. We literally cannot talk about this era without addressing the shadow that hangs over these cities.
No, we cannot. You are referring to the tragedy of the Ciudad Juarez femicides.
Yes. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, Juarez became internationally infamous.
It was a horrific era.
Hundreds of women were abducted, brutally tortured, and murdered. Their bodies were just found dumped in the desert on the outskirts of the city. And a significant number of the identified victims were young maquiladora workers.
It is a deeply traumatic era in the history of the border. However, our dossier explicitly cautions against drawing a simplistic, single-cause conclusion here. We must be analytically careful.
Right.
It is factually incorrect to say the maquiladora system directly caused the murder.
It's not that simple.
The causes of that horrific violence are deeply complex. They involve the rise of organized crime and the cartels, systemic police corruption, a culture of absolute impunity in the justice system, and deep-seated societal misogyny.
It's a toxic cocktail of systemic failures.
It is. But what sociologists and labor historians emphasize is that the maquiladora system undeniably created the conditions of extreme exposure.
Exposure is the key word.
Right. You had a massive influx of young, marginalized women, completely separated from their familial support networks. And because the factories operated around the clock to meet global demand, these women were forced to commute on unreliable, often completely unregulated public transportation.
And in the middle of the night.
Yes. Walking alone through unlit, unpaved shanty towns at 2 or 3 in the morning after a 12-hour shift. The economic model created a highly visible, highly vulnerable, and entirely unprotected population, which predators then exploited.
It really paints a picture of a life where you are completely unprotected from every angle. You are unprotected from the physical deterioration and humiliation inside the factory, and you are literally unprotected from lethal violence outside of it.
You are on your own.
Which naturally forces us to ask the next massive question about human nature. Because human history tells us that when conditions become this dire, when people are subjected to 75-hour weeks, poverty wages, and bodily humiliation, they will eventually hit a breaking point.
Historically, yes.
They will band together, they will strike, they will riot. So if the factory doesn't have armed guards anymore, how on earth are they stopping a full-scale labor revolt today?
That brings us to the concept of the firewall.
The firewall.
Yes. To understand how massive systemic labor organizing is suppressed without the use of a private cavalry, you have to look at the deeply entrenched fusion of state and corporate power in these regions.
Okay.
The system relies on official government labor boards and the strategic use of what are known as charro unions or protection unions.
I need you to break down those terms for us. What exactly is a charro union?
To understand the charro union, we have to briefly touch on 20th century Mexican political history.
Lay it on us.
For over 70 years, Mexico was ruled by a single political party, the PRI. And a core pillar of the PRI's power was its incredibly close alliance with the Central Labor Confederation, which was called the CTM.
So the state and the labor unions were basically one entity?
Exactly. Over decades, this official labor apparatus became deeply corrupt and entirely aligned with state and corporate interests rather than worker interests.
Wow.
So in the context of the maquiladoras, local CTM-affiliated leaders would sign what are called protection contracts with the foreign factory owners.
Protection from what? Like the mafia?
No, protection from genuine independent unions.
Oh.
These are essentially paper unions. They are officially recognized by the state labor boards, they exist on legal documents, but they are completely beholden to management.
They work for the boss.
In the vast majority of cases, these protection contracts are signed by the company and the union boss before the factory even opens its doors. The workers arrive on their first day, and the union is already legally in place, entirely without the workers' knowledge or consent.
Okay, let me make sure I'm fully wrapping my head around the daily reality of this. I'm a worker on the line, right?
Right.
I'm exhausted, I'm underpaid, the ventilation is broken. I go to my coworkers and I say, this is intolerable. We need to form a union, elect our own leaders, and demand better treatment.
Sounds reasonable.
And management basically comes down to the floor, holding a legal document, and says, oh, we're sorry. Under the law, you can't form a union. You already have one. Here is the contract.
That is exactly how the legal trap functions. It creates a flawless illusion of rights.
Illusion.
The paper union acts as a preemptive legal strike against genuine worker organizing. The legal space for a union, the exclusive right to bargain collectively, is already legally occupied by a ghost organization that does exactly what the boss wants.
And they probably charge dues for this, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. The dues for this fake union are often automatically deducted from the workers' already meager paychecks.
It's brilliant in the most cynical way possible. It's honestly like installing a fake thermostat in an office building.
A fake thermostat?
Yeah. The workers look at the wall and they see the dial. They think they have a tool to adjust the temperature, to adjust their working conditions. They get too hot, they go to the wall, they turn the dial down, it clicks. They feel a sense of agency.
Right.
But what they don't know is that behind the plastic casing on the wall, there are no wires. The dial isn't actually connected to the heating or cooling system at all. It's just a placebo. It's there strictly to pacify them, to absorb their complaints, and make them think the system is actually responsive.
The fake thermostat is a superb analogy for the protection union. It perfectly describes this psychological pacification. But the critical moment, the flashpoint of conflict, is when the workers actually realize the thermostat is fake.
When it gets too hot to ignore.
Because eventually, it does get too hot to ignore. And when the workers attempt to rip that plastic dial off the wall, when they attempt to bypass the corrupt system and register a genuinely independent union with real elected leaders, they are met with severe retaliation.
What does that look like?
The dossier highlights that the workers, who are often young women who step up to lead these independent efforts, face intense harassment. They face sudden termination and even physical intimidation by thugs hired by the official unions.
Because the moment you try to build a real thermostat with real wires, you aren't just annoying a middle manager.
No, you're a major threat.
You are threatening the entire structural model of the export economy. You are threatening the cheap labor advantage that keeps the foreign brands from packing up and leaving.
Exactly. And to illustrate how incredibly difficult it is to fight this, we really need to look at a prominent historical example from the dossier. The Hanyang strike in Tijuana in 1997.
Okay, set the scene for us.
This case became a massive landmark labor dispute that ended up exposing the entire system. Hanyang was a maquiladora, but uniquely, it didn't primarily employ young women sewing clothes.
What do they make?
It employed predominantly men who worked as welders. They were building steel truck chassis for the massive South Korean conglomerate Hyundai.
So these are guys doing heavy, dangerous industrial work, sparks, heavy metal, high risk of injury.
Highly dangerous work.
Yeah.
And the conditions were reportedly abysmal. Poor ventilation, a complete lack of safety equipment, poverty wages. And the welders at Hanyang realized their official, state-sanctioned union was doing absolutely nothing to protect them.
The fake thermostat.
Right. So they organized, they went on strike, and they formed a genuinely independent union. They held an election, and the workers voted overwhelmingly to recognize the independent union.
So that's a clear victory for democracy on the factory floor, right? They voted for it.
It should have been. But this is exactly where the state corporate firewall activated.
What did the government do?
The local government labor board, which was closely aligned with the political establishment, the official unions, and the corporate investors who desperately wanted to keep Hyundai happy, they simply stepped in and invalidated the election.
Just erase the votes.
They refused to legally register the independent union, claiming random technicalities. They effectively said the workers' vote didn't matter. Management fired the strike leaders, and the official union brought in replacement workers.
That is maddening. It really highlights the sheer, exhausting, daily courage required from anyone fighting this system. They aren't just fighting a greedy floor boss.
They're fighting an entire apparatus.
They are fighting a systemic alliance. The boss, the official union, and the government's own labor board are all working hand in glove to keep them silent. It's a completely stacked deck.
It was so blatantly stacked that the Han Young case actually escalated into international trade law.
Oh, wow, really?
Yes. It became the subject of a major labor-side complaint under NAFTA. Human rights groups and American unions actually filed a formal complaint arguing that Mexico was failing to enforce its own labor laws regarding the right to organize.
Did it go anywhere?
There were hearings, reports were issued, and it brought massive public embarrassment to the Mexican government.
But did it change anything for the actual welders?
Ultimately, no. The bureaucratic pressure from the NAFTA complaint was too slow and too weak to save the union. The company eventually just moved its operations.
They used the ultimate weapon.
They utilized mobility. But the Han Young case proved to the global capital markets that the modern enclave model, this combination of the threat of exit and the firewall of protection unions, worked flawlessly to suppress wages.
It proved the system was bulletproof.
And because it worked so perfectly in Mexico, the system was ready to be exported globally.
Right, because if you can reliably enforce low wages and high output without armed guards, just by using the structural terror of capital flight and a labyrinth of fake unions, you can take that exact blueprint anywhere in the world where there's a desperate demand for jobs.
Anywhere.
The model just goes on the move.
And the dossier meticulously traces this migration. It traces the migration of these garment and assembly jobs throughout the late 1990s and into the 2000s.
Where did they go?
Well, as wages in the northern Mexican border cities marginally increased due to the rising cost of living, or as independent organizing became slightly more visible and troublesome, the capital simply exercised its primary weapon. It moved south.
Looking for the next pool of cheaper, more desperate labor.
Exactly. We see a massive expansion of the maquiladora model into the free trade zones of Central America. Specifically, what is known in economic and geopolitical terms as the Northern Triangle.
That's Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, right?
So those three.
Why specifically those three countries? Like, what made the Northern Triangle the perfect landing spot for the factories leaving Mexico?
Several structural factors align perfectly for capital. First, these countries were emerging from decades of devastating civil wars and political instability in the 80s and 90s.
So their economies were completely shattered.
Destroyed. Their governments were absolutely desperate for any form of foreign investment and employment to stabilize their societies. Consequently, they offered incredibly aggressive incentives to foreign brands.
Like what?
Massive tax holidays, heavily subsidized industrial parks, and extremely lax regulatory enforcement. Furthermore, the U.S. government actively encouraged this migration through regional trade policies.
Always the architect.
Exactly. It eventually culminated in agreements like NAFTA, which locked in the duty-free access to the American market for these Central American countries.
So the U.S. policy essentially paves a superhighway for the garment industry to slide further south. And the sheer numbers of workers caught up in this today are massive, right?
Very significant. While the heavier automotive and high-tech electronics manufacturing heavily remained in Mexico due to infrastructure needs, the hypermobile garment industry just flooded Central America.
Because sewing machines are easy to move.
Exactly. Today, those three countries, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, currently host roughly 350,000 garment workers laboring inside these free trade zones.
That is a massive workforce.
To break that down, you have roughly 150,000 workers in Guatemala, 120,000 in Honduras, and 80,000 in El Salvador.
And it didn't stop there.
Oh, not at all. Of course, the migration of capital didn't stop at the Pacific coast. The model eventually went truly global, jumping across the ocean to China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and other parts of Asia.
And the engine driving this relentless, globe-spanning search for the absolute cheapest possible labor pool is a phenomenon that touches every single listener tuning in right now.
Fast fashion.
It's fast fashion. It's the consumer demand for a new style of t-shirt, a new dress, a new pair of shoes to hit the mall racks every 2 weeks. And it has to cost less than a cup of coffee.
That speed and price point is the driver.
The sheer crushing pressure of that consumer demand is what forces the brands to squeeze the subcontractors, who in turn violently squeeze the workers. And the American public actually saw this collision between our demand for cheap clothes and the brutal reality of the factory floor. It burst into the open back in the mid-90s.
Yes, the era of the 1990s anti-sweatshop scandals. This was a pivotal moment in public consciousness.
I really want to ask everyone listening, do you remember seeing these headlines? Because depending on your age, you might remember the absolute media frenzy.
It was everywhere.
These weren't just dry academic reports. They were massive front-page news stories on every major network in the U.S. You had the Gap campaign in '95. Investigative labor groups found that Gap clothing was being produced by a subcontractor called Mandarin International in an El Salvadoran free trade zone where workers were subjected to horrific abuses and union leaders were fired.
It was a massive scandal.
And then, perhaps the most famous, earth-shattering scandal of them all, the Kathie Lee Gifford revelation in '96.
That specific case completely altered the public relations landscape for global apparel brands.
For those who don't know, Kathie Lee Gifford was one of the most famous, beloved daytime television hosts in America at the time. She had a wildly popular, super wholesome clothing line sold exclusively at Walmart.
Her name was on everything.
But a labor rights investigator named Charles Kernahan, who ran the National Labor Committee, uncovered her supply chain. He discovered that Kathie Lee's clothing was being sewn in a sweatshop in Honduras by teenage girls.
Yeah, or young girls.
Some as young as 13 and 14, working grueling hours for pennies. Kernahan brought this to the media, he testified before Congress, and he brought a 15-year-old Honduran worker named Wendy Diaz to the U.S. to tell her story.
That visual was incredibly powerful.
Kathie Lee Gifford actually cried on national television. It was this huge, seismic cultural moment where the invisible legal wall between the American consumer buying a shirt at Walmart and the Central American child sewing it on a factory floor just suddenly shattered.
If we step back and connect these visceral scandals to the bigger picture of the global trade architecture, those 90s revelations ignited a core debate that still rages furiously today regarding brand responsibility.
Who is actually at fault?
Exactly. And this is exactly where the complex architecture of the subcontractor system becomes critical to understand. You have to remember, the massive global brands, the famous labels printed on the tags, the companies with the shiny flagship stores in New York or London, they almost never own the actual factories making their clothes.
They don't own the sewing machines.
No, they intentionally utilize layers upon layers of local subcontractors.
I'm trying to visualize this legal shield. The brand designs the shirt, they dictate the fabric, they dictate the exact price, but they don't sign the paycheck of the woman sewing it. It's that legal distance again.
Exactly. The brand signs a contract with a massive holding company who subcontracts it to a regional manager who subcontracts it to the factory owner in Honduras.
Plausible deniability.
The brands utilize these subcontractors precisely to maintain absolute legal and reputational distance from the grim conditions on the factory floor. So when a scandal like Kathie Lee Gifford or the Gap breaks in the media, the brand's legal and PR teams immediately deploy a standardized defense.
What do they say?
They go to the microphones and say, "We are shocked and appalled. We do not own that factory. The local subcontractor lied to us and violated our strict corporate code of conduct. We are immediately cutting ties with that specific factory."
It's a few bad apples in a distant country. We had no idea we are terminating the contract. Which, if you think about it for 2 seconds, is deeply ironic.
It's incredibly cynical.
Their solution to a human rights abuse scandal is simply to utilize the exact same weapon of capital flight. They pull the orders, the factory collapses, the abused workers lose whatever meager income they had, and the brand quietly moves the order to a different factory down the road that just hasn't been caught by a journalist yet.
It is the ultimate exercise of the exit threat, just framed as a moral stance.
Wow.
But the entire premise of the modern anti-sweatshop movement, the argument that activists like Charles Kernahan brought to the American public, is that this legal distance is a convenient corporate fiction when it comes to moral and practical responsibility.
It's smokescreen.
The advocates argue that the brand's immense concentrated purchasing power makes them inherently inescapably responsible for the conditions of the workers.
Because they set the rules of the entire game.
Precisely. If a massive, multi-billion-dollar global brand sits down at a negotiating table with a local factory owner in El Salvador and dictates, "We will only pay you 50 cents per completed shirt, and we demand 1 million shirts loaded onto a cargo ship by next Tuesday, or you lose the contract forever."
The factory has no choice.
The brand is mathematically forcing that subcontractor to commit abuses. The subcontractor has to pay poverty wages, they have to mandate forced unpaid overtime, and they have to lock the fire doors to keep people at their stations just to meet the brand's impossible price and deadline.
Right, it's physics. You can't violently squeeze a stone, demand that blood comes out, and then act shocked and appalled when the local manager doing the squeezing ends up with bruised and bloodied hands.
A great way of putting it.
The overarching economic structure dictated by the brand actively requires the abuse to function.
That is the forceful argument of the critics. The immense purchasing power at the top of the supply chain creates the suffocating conditions at the bottom, no matter how many layers of independent subcontractors exist on paper.
It's unavoidable.
Which brings us to the final, and analytically perhaps the most difficult, section of the research dossier. The contested legacy of the maquiladora and free trade zone system itself.
How we judge the whole thing.
Right. With the U.S. consumer market so heavily implicated, and the grim realities of the factory floor exposed through human rights reports and high-profile media scandals, we have to grapple with how this system is still defended, how it is intellectually sustained and even actively promoted by governments today.
And as we navigate this final section, I really want to be completely clear with you listening. Our goal here as hosts is to lay out the reality of the debate impartially.
We aren't taking sides.
We are not here to preach. We are looking at the foundational arguments of how both sides, the critics and the defenders, evaluate the existence and the expansion of these free trade zones.
The central, highly contested debate revolves around the ultimate net effect on the workers themselves. In the grand sweep of economic history, how do we judge this system?
Let's start with the critics.
On one side of the debate, human rights critics, labor organizers, and sociologists point to the empirical reality of everything we've just discussed over the last hour. They point to the hard data of poverty wages that consistently fail to meet basic human living standards.
The 75-hour weeks.
Yes. They point to the systemic, documented abuses, the invasive bodily inspections like the pregnancy testing regime, the physically destructive work hours, and the aggressive state-backed union busting using paper unions.
It's a massive list of abuses.
They argue forcefully that this is a system of profound structural exploitation that strips wealth from the global south and traps developing nations in a permanent state of economic subservience.
Okay, so that is the critical view, really focusing on human rights and structural inequality. But then, on the other side of the aisle, defenders of the system, mainstream developmental economists, international trade officials, and the multinational corporations themselves, they argue something very different.
They look at the exact same data, the exact same factories, and come to a different conclusion.
They argue that these maquiladora jobs, however flawed and difficult they may be, generally pay slightly more and offer more stability than the local alternatives available in those impoverished regions.
The developmental economics argument is crucial to understand here. The defenders point out that the alternative to a maquiladora job in rural Honduras or a Mexican border town is often not a comfortable middle-class office job.
It's not like they're turning down a job at a bank.
Exactly. The alternative is desperate informal street vending, dangerous involvement with the cartels, or a back-breaking subsistence agriculture that relies on unpredictable rainfall. They argue that these foreign-owned factories, for all their faults, have historically brought crucial foreign currency investment.
And infrastructure.
Right, early-stage infrastructure development and integration into the global economy.
And there is a specific, deeply complex gender dynamic to this defense as well, right?
There is. A major argument put forth by defenders is that the maquiladora system, by specifically targeting young women, historically brought mass wage-earning opportunities to women in deeply patriarchal societies where they previously had zero path to independent economic survival.
That's a huge shift in society.
It is. For many young women migrating from rural villages, the factory wage, however meager, represented the first time in their family's history that a woman actually held her own money, completely outside the direct control of a father or a husband.
And what's fascinating and just deeply complicated is that both of those viewpoints, the critics pointing to exploitation and the defenders pointing to economic lifelines, they are drawn from the exact same physical reality.
The facts aren't in dispute.
As the dossier carefully points out, the disagreement isn't really about the facts of the factory floor anymore. Both sides generally acknowledge that the wages are incredibly low, the hours are brutal, and the work is exhausting. The debate is fundamentally philosophical.
It's about the standard of judgment.
Exactly. It is about the standard of judgment we use. Are we judging the system by asking, is $1 an hour in a hot factory better than absolute starvation in a failed agricultural economy? Or are we judging it against a standard of basic human rights, dignity, and a living wage that actually allows a family to thrive?
It is a profound debate over the acceptable human cost of global industrialization.
It's a debate between looking at the system as better than absolute destitution versus comparing it to a standard of human dignity. And honestly, there is a really tragic irony buried at the very heart of the developmental defense.
What is that?
Well, the defenders say the system empowered women by giving them jobs, right? But the very thing that made these women employable to the foreign brands in the first place, their intense vulnerability, their lack of political power, their desperation, the societal assumption that they would be docile and accept far lower pay than men, that specific vulnerability is a foundation stone of the entire fast fashion supply chain.
It relies on it.
The system didn't arrive to cure their vulnerability, it arrived to precisely calculate and monetize it.
That is a very sharp distillation of the paradox. The enclave system offers a wage, it offers a tenuous lifeline, but it extracts a tremendous physical, social, and psychological cost.
And you can never forget the threat.
Exactly. That lifeline is governed always, every single day, by the structural terror that even this meager wage could be taken away tomorrow if they demand just a little bit more.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the research dossier, I really want to pull all of these threads together for you. We started this hour by picturing the old historical company town, the banana plantation with its armed guards, the timber monopoly with its private cavalry.
The Gendarmerie Volante.
Right. And what we've seen is that the company town didn't disappear into the history books. It just evolved. It adapted. It took off its dusty military uniform, put on a sharp corporate business suit, and moved into the tax-free export processing zone.
A software update for the empire.
Exactly. It replaced the blunt physical violence of a private militia with the sheer structural economic terror of capital flight, the invisible weapon.
And exploring that evolution leaves us with a final lingering question to consider, one that looks toward the immediate future of the global economy.
Okay, what is it?
We spent this time seeing how the entire power of the modern enclave, its ultimate disciplining mechanism, rests entirely on mobility, on the constant threat to leave one country in search of a cheaper, more docile human labor pool in another.
The relentless global race to the bottom.
Exactly. But we have to ask, what happens to this entire intricate system? And more importantly, what happens to the hundreds of thousands of garment and assembly workers across Mexico and Central America when technology completely disrupts that race?
Technology.
What happens in the next 10 or 20 years when automation, advanced robotics, and artificial intelligence eventually progress to the point where the relentless search for cheap human labor becomes completely obsolete?
Wow, that is a chilling thought. Where does the enclave go when it no longer needs the workers at all? The entire power dynamic shifts again.
It vanishes.
The ultimate threat isn't that the factory will pack up and move to Honduras or Vietnam for cheaper wages. The threat is that the factory will pack up and move back to Ohio fully run by machines. Because a robotic sewing arm doesn't demand a minimum wage, it doesn't form an independent union, it doesn't need a fake thermostat, and it doesn't get pregnant.
It is a looming technological shift that could render the entire maquiladora and free trade zone model obsolete, structurally abandoning the host countries and leaving the millions of human beings who depended on that fragile wage completely stranded in the desert.
It brings us right back to that empty copper mine, that abandoned banana plantation we pictured at the start of the hour. Only this time it's a massive, empty sheet metal warehouse sitting quietly on the border. Stripped of the sewing machines, stripped of the profits, with the invisible weapon of capital flight finally turned off, leaving nothing behind but the silence and the people who built the wealth. Something to think about the next time you check the tag on a cheap t-shirt.